If you're new on staff, you're just popping in somewhere, give it some time. You probably don't have enough context yet to understand all of the pieces that are going on. You may make changes off the front end thinking something's really small, and they may be like the hill to die on for them. Or it may be the other way around, where you're making a change that you think is going to be helpful because you just don't like something, but maybe it's not, you don't like it because you don't understand it. Once you begin to understand it, then a little more, you might see the value in it. And so you need to take some time, really think through, understand the greater context, ask lots and lots of questions to get a better understanding of the whole deal before you start moving towards some change.
Welcome to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast, helping you survive and thrive in youth ministry. And now, here's your host, Jody Livingston.
Well, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the show today, wherever you are. Welcome. Thanks for jumping in and making this podcast today a part of your day. We are starting off 2025 with this episode number 144, talking about how to make changes, particularly how to do it without getting fired. And so we want you to do it well. We want you to be able to make changes, but we don't want you to get in trouble while you're doing it. And it's pretty typical this time of year. Maybe you're thinking about some things as you kind of look back on 2024. What are some things that you want to see changed going forward? And so oftentimes then this is starting to be that time of year where we start thinking through things that we want to change. I find in student ministry, it comes in kind of seasons and cycles. And sometimes we just up and decide we want to change things. And most of the time when I am talking to youth pastors or youth ministers who are kind of in some hot water over some things or in some trouble or feeling some frustration from leadership, a lot of times it comes back to just change, making changes and doing that pretty poorly. So we'll jump in here today and talk through kind of what that looks like, because I am a pretty firm believer that you can change just about anything you want if you do it the right way and in the right timing. You can accomplish way more than you think you can in the long run, but not as much as you'd hope to in the short run. And making changes is going to be a skill you're going to need. There's a process, I think, that works that we'll talk through, regardless of your context and size. So hopefully today's some really practical things for you. Hey, while you're listening, if you haven't yet subscribed to follow the show, make sure you're doing that so that you get these episodes when they come out. It helps a ton as well for others to find the show and be able to follow it. If you would leave a review as well. But we hope you're finding it helpful. If you are, I'd love for you to share that with another youth pastor. And the goal here is always to find and make things really scalable for you, practical, and something you can put into place or at least learn from, regardless of your context and size and where you are. So today I think will be none other. Okay, so we talk about changes. Let me kind of frame this a little bit. I don't think people are afraid of change. I think we run into a lot of problems when making changes, but I don't think it's because people are afraid of change. I think people aren't afraid of change as much as they're afraid of the loss that comes with change. And so that's going to be really important to remember as you're thinking through changes that you'll make, that oftentimes the pushback you're going to get isn't necessarily against the change itself, but the thing that is felt, the loss that is felt through the change. And I'll explain a little bit even more on what that means. So here's kind of how I'm going to break it down for us today. I'm going to give you two whats, a why, a when, a who, which all kind of explains for us the how. So two whats, a why, a when, a who, which leads us to the how. And then we'll end kind of where we just started here, talking about the loss. What do we do with that? Okay. And so two whats. Here's what we're going to think through. When you're thinking through what you're changing, that's the first what. What is it that you want to change? That's really important. What is it that you are thinking of changing? Is it just, you're just changing it because you can? You often, historically, you'd go to a youth ministry conference. I'd say youth ministers come back from that and they'd want to change everything because they sat in some breakout or they read, maybe now it's a book or a podcast or whatever that is. And oftentimes we're not sure what we're changing. We just want to change something. And so you need to be able to identify kind of what it is that you are wanting to, in fact, change. And if you can't articulate specifically what it is, then maybe you need to go back and think about it. Now, you may know, maybe you want to change your curriculum, or you want to change the camp you go to. You want to change the mission trips that you're going on. You want to change your volunteer training process. I mean, there's a lot of different things. You want to change what your worship looks like, or what your midweek looks like, or all those things, whatever it is. You need to be able to articulate that pretty clearly. And really, you need to know why, okay? You need to know why you're wanting to change it. And you need to be able to articulate that why very, very clearly. Because if you can't articulate why you're wanting to change it, it may not be worth changing, for one. And two, you're not going to be able to combat that feeling of loss if you can't explain the why. Okay, so once you know what it is that you're changing, and you know why it is you're changing, then you're able to take this change and suddenly frame it for people so they no longer see it as just loss, because there will be some sense of loss. But more importantly, you're able to kind of frame it and point them to the win that will come through changing whatever this is that you have. Okay, so what is it that you're wanting to change? Why is that? And how do you then take that idea of loss and make that and frame that as a win through the understanding of the why? Okay, so what is it that you're changing? Why are you wanting to change it? And then when does it need to happen? Rarely do you need to change something right now. Typically, you know what needs to be changed. Think through timing. So for student ministry, let's talk that really practically. Typically, there's 3 great times to change things, okay? Depending on what it is. Obviously, if it's camp or if it's a mission trip, and those are happening in summer, or those are happening over breaks, that may differentiate the timing of that. But it doesn't necessarily change the planning of that. And so when you talk about when in student ministry, you typically have the start of the school year. That is a time of change and transition for families normally. So you're less likely to get resistance there. The first of the year, right around now, as we head into a new year, people are usually making changes to themselves. And so they're more likely probably to accept some change around this time of year and at the end of the school year. So those beginning of the school year, kind of right around the first of the calendar year, and then the end of the school year. Those 3 times typically are pretty good times to make some changes and to shift some things around, because they are times where, as a normal rhythm for families and parents and volunteers, we're kind of used to things changing. And so you need to know then when. If the change needs to be made, say at the end of the school year, then you probably need to be thinking through that much earlier. Okay. So how do you start to move toward that change? And you're making steps along the way. And that really kind of combines to the who. So once you know what it is you're changing, and you understand why you want to change it, and you understand when the change needs to happen, then you need to stop and think through who it affects. Does it affect parents, students, volunteers, your upper leadership? Is it a productions team, maybe in your context? Is there a worship component? Is it your facilities or operations or whatever that looks like in your church? Is there transportation involved? Is there space involved that you may need to reserve or make sure is available? Is the school involved if you're working in the community, depending on what the change is? Is there a camp that is involved if you're trying to change a camp? So just make a list of who is involved, everybody who's affected by the change. And then that leads you then to the how. Okay, how does this change have to happen? How does this change need to happen? I'm going to take my list then of who's involved and who's affected, and I'm going to start going through and having conversations and making sure that I am not forgetting something, or there's something I'm not thinking through of what that looks like and how that will affect them. I don't want to make a change and then suddenly they're having to deal with it after the fact. I want to make sure that I've communicated it with my leadership well, those above me. I want to make sure I've touched base with every other department or ministry that might be affected by the change. And then I want to make sure I've communicated it down to my volunteers, parents, and students. And then I have a really clear timeline, right? So maybe it's a 6-month timeline kind of put together a bit of a change management plan, and then walking through each step. How do we start to take steps toward that change? So let me give you some examples of some changes, some big drastic changes over the years that I've made and what that looked like timeline wise, in case you're curious. So at a previous church, I came on staff. They had been going to the same church or camp for a really long time, and they loved this camp. And I wasn't 100% sure because I had not been yet, but I was pretty sure based on what I read and saw that I was not going to like the camp. So, and I knew, by the way, a camp that I had been taking students to that I loved, and I really felt like it would be good for those students to go to as well. So what we did is I got hired in January. Camp had already been booked for that summer. Things were already in motion. Deposits already paid. Fine. Great. We're going to that camp that they'd always gone to. What happened then is in the spring, I took our volunteers to the camp because they had a physical location. It wasn't like at a campus or anything, a school campus. I took them to the camp I wanted to take our students to in the spring for a quick kind of overnight leader retreat. It was good for me to get to know the leaders because I was brand new. It was good for them to see the camp and hear from the camp. And then I told the leaders there that we were going to be bringing students there in the fall for a fall retreat. So around April, we do the leader retreat with our volunteers. Summer comes, we go to the camp they'd always come to. Fall comes around, we are now promoting to the students a fall retreat that we're taking to the camp that I want us to go to. Our leaders have seen the camp, loved it. Easy for them to help me promote the fall retreat. We get the kids to the fall retreat, have a blast, and then we start telling them, hey, this is where we're going to come to camp starting this next year. Because they had a great time and a great experience at the fall retreat, because our leaders had had a great experience prior to that, it was a pretty easy transition. We had some, of course, that were, again, sad, upset at the loss of the other camp, but we took more kids that summer than we had been taking to the other in quite a while, in a few years, because it was something new. And, maybe the upperclassmen kind of boycotted it, but overall, it was a really, really easy transition for us. Okay, so that's one example. Maybe a more drastic example was a few years ago, we were making a shift to move our student programming off of the weekend entirely and putting it all on the midweek. So we're in a small group context, not a Sunday school driven context here. And we were having kind of our student service on top of our normal services. And so for a number of reasons, I wanted to shift that off of the weekend and get us to midweek, and felt like it would be a healthy thing. That conversation started happening about 8 months prior to doing it, and started with my leadership, started with our kind of staff team, started talking through the different departments, how that would affect them, asking a lot of questions, wanting to understand what that would look like for them. Then a few months out, we started sprinkling it to our volunteers. Hey, this is what we're headed toward. Then in the middle of the summer, we started announcing to our parents and families that was going to happen. And then the change finally happened when the new school year picked up, which was kind of right around August, September-ish, right? And so it took us a good 8 months or so to make that change. And we really had very little pushback on that change because, again, we knew the why. We were really clear on that. We knew what we were changing. We knew when it needed to happen. Again, we were aiming for the beginning of the school year because that's typically a good time of transition. We talked to everyone we could possibly think of who was involved, got buy-in for leadership above us so that we could do that, and then communicated that change pretty consistently. All of those things then allowed us to understand how we needed to go about making the change. Now, here's one caveat I want to say, and this is really, really important. Regardless of the scale or the size of the change that you make, you really always want to make sure that you're using positive language. So, for example, let's say you've got a small group that is not so small anymore. They've grown, and you need another group out of that because you know that after a certain point, a certain size, that group's not going to grow. It's going to stagnate. It'll start to shrink back down, and you'll stall. So instead of coming in and say, hey, we're going to divide this group so that we can grow, you give a good why. Hey, we want to grow. We want to reach more. So we're going to divide the group. You want to use positive language, right? So we're not going to divide. We're not going to split. That sounds negative. It automatically kind of will make everyone feel a little more defensive. We're going to say we're going to launch another group out, right? When we moved programming off the weekend, we didn't say we're canceling weekend programming. That's what people wanted to say. And they would say, I don't understand why you're canceling programming. And we would reframe that for them. We're not canceling anything. We're still doing what we've been doing on the weekend. We're just shifting it to midweek. So it was a shift, not a change, not even really a move, although move is more positive than cancel. It was shift. We were very intentional with that language. And so that's kind of that second what. We're hitting it at the end. What is being changed? Why are we changing it? We need to be able to frame the change as a win. Then when is the change happening? Who all does it affect? How do we then bring about the change? And then what is it that we need to communicate about this change and to who? And so all of that kind of comes into that. And really it's scalable. You're making a small change, great. But making a really big change, the same process. Sometimes your lists are going to be shorter. A smaller change may affect less people. Doesn't mean you're not going to still have to walk through those steps. A big change is going to require more time. You need more runway on that to be able to get people on board. I never want to walk into a meeting where I'm explaining a change where I don't understand and haven't had a million conversations with everybody in the room. So I kind of know where everybody already is. What is it they're already thinking so that I can kind of combat a bit of their questions or confusion or frustrations and really point them and lead them to where I'm trying to feel like at least, hey, this is where I think we're headed. Let's head this direction. Let's run here and be able to articulate with a clear vision of the win, W-I-N, right? What is the win that comes through this change once we actually make it? Okay, so what is it that we're going to change? That's the first what. Why are we changing it? That's so we can articulate the win, so we can combat the fear of loss, the feeling of loss. When, W-H-E-N, does the change actually need to happen, right? Who all is affected by it? That then allows us and informs us on how it is that we should actually make the change, which leads us to the second what, which is what is it then that we need to communicate to everyone about the change. Okay. Also, as a side note, you probably should not make change if you can help it, at least probably in your first year. If you're new on staff, you're just popping in somewhere, give it some time. You probably don't have enough context yet to understand all of the pieces that are going on. You may make changes off the front end thinking something's really small, and they may be like the hill to die on for them. Or it may be the other way around, where you're making a change that you think is going to be helpful because you just don't like something, but maybe it's not, you don't like it because you don't understand it. Once you begin to understand it, then a little more, you might see the value in it. And so you need to take some time, really think through, understand the greater context, ask lots and lots of questions to get a better understanding of the whole deal before you start moving towards some change. And typically, I would say, start with smaller changes before you really move towards bigger changes. When it comes to change, there's two ways to do it, right? There's the slow, easy way, which is kind of like that old metaphor of like putting a frog in a pot and just turning the water up to boil. And if you can do that, which is kind of what we've laid out here, you'll feel much less resistance over time. The other way is to make them so fast that no one even realizes what you're changing until you've already changed them. That's really tricky. You have to really know what you're doing, and you have to have a ton of understanding of the context, high people skills to pull that off. It's way more stressful and often get you in way more trouble. And so I would highly recommend the slow way here, which is purposeful. It's not so much that slow as methodical. It's very intentional, very purposeful. I need to know what it is that we're changing. I need to understand why we're changing it. I need to know when the best time is to make the change, who all is affected. How then do we go about making this change? What is it that I'm communicating to people so that I can consistently use positive language and frame the messaging around the change so that we can actually make the change without me getting fired, or in this case, you. So anyway, bit shorter an episode today, just some really practical things as I'm thinking through and having conversations with folks on changing some things. Hopefully it's helpful for you. We'll be back next week, another interview. I'm excited for you to hear that one and listen to that one as well. It's going to be a great year here on the podcast, 2025, big things coming. So hang in there. I'm so thankful for you, for being a listener, for what you do in student ministry. Don't give up. I promise you, you're making more of a difference than you think. We'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast. Before you go, hit that subscribe button to keep these conversations coming. For notes, resources, and to join our community, swing by thelongerhaul.com. Stay encouraged. Keep making a difference. And remember, we're in this for the longer haul. Catch you on the next episode.